Last year, during the economic collapse, several economic events happened. The stock market crashed, unemployment rates hit record high levels, and it seemed like every business you could think of was on the brink of bankruptcy. And if these events weren't bad enough, quietly, in the background, something else was happening. Something that we haven't seen in hundreds of years. An event that could very well change the fabric of our society, culture, and global economy like we have never seen before. France in the early 1700s was the most populated and richest country in Europe. And over the next 7 decades, things went pretty well. Mortality rates were declining, GDP continuously increased, education and literacy skyrocketed, industrialization was being implemented into the country, and trade with countries like Italy and Spain increased by more than 900% during that time. Now, on its surface, this all seemed great. But in reality, nearly 1/3 of the population of France was living in poverty. And to make things worse, almost the entirety of the middle class was struggling by the year 1770. And those two issues, combined with a compilation of government debt and burdensome tax policies, led to a new idea. You see, France at the time had 3 classes of people. You had the clergy, the nobles, and then everyone else, who were largely composed of the middle class and the peasants. In fact, 98% of the entire population was in that third class, yet nearly all of the benefits of the current economy went to the nobles and the clergy. For example, the nobles and clergy only composed about 2% of the population, yet had 2/3 of the say in government. Also, nobles and clergy did not have to pay any taxes at all, despite them being extremely wealthy. All this meant was that even though France as a whole country experienced prosperity over the previous 7 or 8 decades, the prosperity really only went to those that were rich and powerful in the society. And this all came to a head in the late 1700s when France experienced a big problem. Several years of poor harvests from their farmland led to many people in France going hungry. But the nobles, the king, and the clergy all seemed to be fairly well fed and were able to pay higher prices and outbid the peasants for food. That, along with the king's inability to collect ample amounts of taxes and overprinting of the French currency, forced King Louis XVI to call upon all 3 classes of citizens to get together and figure out a solution to this economic crisis. The third class of citizens wanted the wealthy to pay taxes and for the government to cut down on spending. The king mainly just wanted money and wanted to maintain the government spending, and the nobles and clergy wanted to not only avoid paying any taxes, but they wanted even more economic benefits from the current system. And so it was after this assembly of the king and 3 classes that led to one of the most important moments in the history of the Western world. You see, after the average hungry and poor citizens realized that the entirety of the downside of the current economic and taxation system was on them, while simultaneously seeing no upside when times were good, they decided to revolt and create their own system from scratch. This time without any nobles, without a divine king, and without a clergy. So the citizens created a revolution. They began rebelling at sites like Bastille, and soon abolished things like feudal rights, tithes, and unequal taxations of peasants and nobles. They eventually went on to reform their system multiple times, stating that laws and policies come from people, not from kings or gods, and these laws should be applied equally to everyone. Now, even though the French Revolution may not have been as successful as some may think, and some say it went too far, others say it didn't go far enough, it is important to know this. During their economic crisis, average people were hit the hardest, and the elite of society experienced almost no downside. The unfair taxation system, where the wealthiest paid the least amount in taxes, also created an unsettled middle class. The compilation of government debt, the devaluing of currency, the exclusion of the lower class from political positions of power, and the view of rampant inequality between the super rich and the poor, all of these things led to a complete transformation of society. Does any of this sound familiar to you? You see, this transformation of society in France, that was really caused by inequality and lack of resources for the poor, led France to ultimately losing their status as Europe's #1 economic power, while conceding that spot to the rising power of the British. And later on, the philosopher Denis Diderot went on to say, "We should fear a too unequal division of wealth resulting in a small number of opulent citizens and a multitude of citizens living in misery." And well, that brings us to today. Now, I am not saying that we are on the brink of a revolution by any means, but one can't help but draw parallels between the French Revolution and today. You see, most people realize two important aspects of economic inequality. One of which is that when a society gets too equal under poor economic circumstances, the society collapses and a revolution begins. The second is that when a society becomes too unequal under poor economic circumstances, the society also collapses and a revolution begins. Now, over the past 13 months, we have seen the expansion of wealth for just a few citizens on scales that we have never really seen before. All this time while simultaneously seeing the working class people struggle and live paycheck to paycheck. So as of today, the bottom 50% of Americans, which is roughly 164 million people, have a combined net worth of about $2.1 trillion. That's about $12,000 per human. And that net worth is usually tied up in things like cars, checking accounts, savings accounts, and maybe some stocks or a 401k. But now, if you were to combine the wealth of the 25 richest people in the United States, you would have the same amount of wealth as the bottom 164 million Americans. And this wealth is almost always tied up into a small percentage ownership of a very large company, such as Amazon or Tesla. In fact, since the pandemic started, the world's 2,700 or so billionaires have seen their net worths increase by on average 44%. And for comparison, the average middle-class American has seen their income cut by on average about 3% over the last 13 months, and has seen a slight increase or about a net zero increase in wealth thanks to the stimulus checks canceling out some of the downsides, and the lack of average people being able to use their disposable income on things because of the lockdowns. Now, by the way, this does not mean that the wealthy are evil or that we should eat the rich or anything like that. It is simply a statement on the level of wealth inequality that we are seeing today. And in fact, there's another side to this argument. You see, there is a saying that a rising tide lifts all boats, and all that means is that if poor people were to get slightly richer, and the ultra wealthy were to get a lot richer, that should mean that everybody wins because everyone ends up in a better place than where they started. And on paper, this is a good idea. And it's actually a big part of the basis of how capitalism works, and part of the reason why billions of people were able to come out of poverty over the last century. But when inequality gets too extreme, humans tend to react in a different way. For example, there's a well-known experiment that has been done with monkeys and with humans, and it's an experiment where if you were to have one person and give them $10 for doing a simple task, they will temporarily be happier than they were before receiving the $10. And that's just because they had $10 more than they had before. However, if that person were to see you give the person next to them, let's say $1,000 for doing a similar task or for doing no task at all, then the original person will actually end up angrier than when the experiment started. And it's important to note that this reaction doesn't apply to all humans by any means, but it is a decent analogy for how humans and a lot of animals react to extreme amounts of inequality. So thinking back to the French Revolution, the reason why the revolution occurred was not because of some great Enlightenment thinking, it was because of wealth inequality, and the resources of the entire economy were not going to the people at the bottom and the middle class. And at the time, the nobles, who composed just over 1% of the population, owned about 35% of the wealth in France. Well, as of today, 1% of the United States owns just under 32% of the wealth of the country. That is a dramatic increase from the 28% we saw just under a decade ago. And you should also consider the other similarities between the French Revolution and today, like how the extremely wealthy don't pay anywhere near the same percentage of taxes as the average person. I mean, billionaire Warren Buffett, for example, always talks about how his upper middle class secretary has a tax rate of about 36%. Meanwhile, Warren Buffett has a tax rate of about 18% thanks to the lower capital gains tax that billionaires take advantage of. You could also look at the compilation of government debt which sent France into crisis mode and compare that to the situation that is also happening today all across the world. France also started overprinting its currency a few hundred years ago, and well, we are doing that today as well. And another thing is that there is rising competition coming from around the world that is putting pressure on the #1 economic superpower. Several hundred years ago, that was Britain, and today, that is China. Now, even though there are a ton of similarities between the French Revolution's economic crisis and today, I will say that there's one or two really big differences. One of which is that during the French Revolution, a very large portion of the population was facing a life or death hunger and starvation crisis, meaning that a revolution in their eyes was a necessity in order to stay alive. Meanwhile, today in the United States, starvation is a much rarer issue, although I will say that food insecurity is still a problem. Starvation itself is not really the same case. And the second key difference, in my opinion, is that France was essentially in a perpetual state of war for decades, and that in itself can do a ton of harm to an economy and a government. And today, there's not anywhere near the same amount of warfare as was going on several hundred years ago. So all in all, as previously mentioned, too much inequality is an issue that tends to lead to revolutions. But the same goes for too little inequality. At the end of the day, the people have to decide how much is too much or too little. Do you think that the funneling of wealth to the very top over the last 13 months is something that will end up causing some sort of transformation within our society? Or do you think that the society will continue to hum along for the foreseeable future and everything will be okay? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. And also, still over 90% of you who watch my videos are not subscribed. So it'd mean a lot to me if you did that and subscribe to my channel, as it helps me out a lot. Also, please check out my second channel down below, and feel free to click on my documentaries playlist for videos just like this. Anyways, make sure to click on that playlist to see my next video, and I will see you guys there in just a few seconds.